What is up, guys? Frosty Aussie 0232 here today for another Frosty Features. Today, we have the first of our incoming Alpha Flight team, the team that's going to be all about those spotlight raids, etc., etc. So, we are going to get into it. We're starting off with the Speedster, the North Star. So what this is, if you haven't seen it before, is a comic book background on the tunes that you use in Marvel Strike Force. And I am your guide, so sit back and enjoy the ride. Oh my god. Alright, according to Scopely, this is the blog post description, the background that they give on the character in the blog post. We will rate this at the end of the feature, but we're going to read it for right now. Northstar, Jean-Paul Barbier, is Quebec-born mutant with the ability to fly and move at superhuman speeds. A former professional skier and Olympic athlete, his life took a dramatic turn when he discovered his mutant powers and subsequently joined the superhero team Alpha Flight. Northstar was also one of the first openly gay superheroes in American comic books, using his platform to advocate for equality and acceptance while battling threats against mutants and humankind alike. We will rate this at the end of the feature. This is our man, Northstar, name Jean-Paul Barbier. I looked up the pronunciation of a few things within this feature. I think I'm close. Let me know in the comments how bad I'm doing. First appearance, X-Men number 120 in 1979. Hot mother. So, this is a cameo, a cameo appearance of the entire first grouping of Alpha Flight. The first run of Alpha Flight. It is a cameo appearance. It shows all of them, just in this situation, right? So, but I count cameos as first appearances. I'm one of those comic book people. Powers and abilities, light generation. This is really important and surprisingly left out in the blog post. Light generation is actually kind of one of the main things that Northstar does. He essentially manipulates his molecules in such a way that he can move them through space, and in doing so create sort of a photo-reflective effect. Which is how he gets his super speed. He also uses this to create concussive blasts. This dude's not just another Quicksilver, right? Which I feel like, judging by what I've read and what I understand, that's very much how Marvel Strike Force is trying to paint him. He is not another Quicksilver. He's sort of like a dagger that uses light to generate speed, right? So, he's superhuman overall. He has a form of super strength, super reflexes, etc. Obviously, super speed, the concussive blasts, and he can fly. Once again, in this molecule manipulation, he can kind of project which way his molecules move, right? So, with this, he can fly. So his super speed isn't a ground-based ability. It's not actually him running. It's him moving through space, right? So his super speed, even though it comes off as running, is actually just him moving his molecules through space quickly, right? So, yes. Aliases, Jean-Paul Martin. So, Martin, Jean-Paul gets adopted, and his adopted parents' last name, family name, is Martin. So, that's his, like, early life name for a while. Affiliations. So, there's a few affiliations. Northstar's affiliations have picked up a lot since the Cohen story arc. Namely Alpha Flight, the X-Men, and recently the Krakoan version of X-Factor. I just thought it was a fun thing to point out because we're still missing a fifth on X-Factor in Marvel Strike Force. Whoop! Background, he's a Quebecer. I had to Google that. He is a Quebecer and he's Canadian, which is super fun. He is a twin. We'll talk about his twin sister a little bit. The way to look at this is that he is very similar to Quicksilver, but also him and his sister kind of mimic, for my people in the back, the Wonder Twins a little bit. Their powers work better when they're together. That's sort of a big point as far as all this is concerned, so something to keep in mind. Who died? Can't be a superhero, supervillain without somebody dying. And in Northstar's case, his parents twice. So his parents, his birth parents, once again, he's a twin. His birth parents died in a car accident, and then with that, he and his sister are split up in the adoption process, and he is adopted, as I said before, by the Martin family, and they also die in a car accident. Which is sort of really convenient and very interesting choices in writing style, but it's not unrealistic holistically. So after that, we see him kind of drifting around. He becomes a pickpocket, as most speedsters do at one point or another, and he joins the circus and ends up becoming a professional sports person, right? Breaking barriers, as stated in the blog post, Northstar is one of the first openly gay Marvel characters, but one of the big things to consider, Northstar is the first mainstream Marvel superhero to come out as gay. We will talk about that in the notable events. He is also, because of that, they turned around and the first gay marriage in Marvel Comics came from Northstar and his husband Kyle. So there's breaking barriers kind of all the way around. Another big thing just to point out with Northstar is it was heavily hinted for years before he actually comes out. He comes out in, I think it's Alpha Flight 106. I probably wrote that down somewhere. But it's hinted for years and years and years, but still, of course, when the actual situation happened, there was a big pushback against Marvel. Even some of the Marvel execs at the time were really, really angry about it. But if you caught up with some of the creators I've talked about in Frosty Features, one of the creators of Northstar was Chris Claremont, who was a person that tried to break these barriers very early on and was prevented in many, many ways. This is one of the ones where they succeeded in pushing the envelope at the time. Hindsight, a lot of Northstar's kind of coming out, and some of his characters referred to as homophobic. But at the time, it was quite progressive. It's one of those things, what time does to certain things, but very important to be aware of. Northstar himself is not the homophobic thing, it's all the stuff around it and some of the reaction and how the writing turned after, and even when he came out. We'll talk about that a little bit more moving forward, but very interesting character, a lot of politics associated, and a lot to look into, so I highly recommend checking it out. Who would win in a foot race? Hey, we've got a speedster, Quicksilver. What's going on here? Believe it or not, so Northstar is a mutant, and Quicksilver is a mutant depending on when you're reading. Sometimes he's not. Right now, I believe he's not. Who's faster, Quicksilver or Northstar? Turns out, Northstar by a freaking shot, right? So, first off, Aurora, Northstar's twin, is also they essentially share powers. Hers are a little bit more developed. She uses photokinesis, but still light in the speedster. She and Aurora and Northstar both are much, I'm not saying a little bit, I'm saying a lot of bit faster than Quicksilver. Quicksilver's speed is compared to that of sound. Northstar and Aurora's speed is compared to light. There is even some jokes, and it's assumed in the comics that it's a bit of an exaggeration, but there is a hint that Northstar has exceeded the speed of light in his speed. Typically, Northstar has to pull back on his speed because he can damage the area, he can damage himself and the area around him because of how fast he is moving. So significantly faster than Quicksilver. Relationships. So Jean-Paul Barbier is his twin. Jean-Marie Barbier is his twin sister. That is Aurora, the person we've been talking about. Kyle Jeanadu Barbier. Great. That is his husband. And then we have Joanne Barbier, his adopted daughter, who we will talk about here in just a second with notable events. So, with this, we need to look at the beginnings of Alpha Flight. We have Alpha Flight coming. A lot of the CCs I've watched have talked about how they don't really know who Alpha Flight is. We're, a lot of us are Americans and, we're nationalists. We see a Canadian team, right? So, pretend this is a maple leaf and let's hop into Alpha Flight. So, this is the picture from X-Men 120 where it shows all of Alpha Flight. This is what it shows for Northstar. So, with Alpha Flight, for full disclosure, the reason why I know who Alpha Flight is, it's kind of crazy. So, before I had money, back when Frosty was but a wee lad going to flea markets and picking up all of the comic books he could for a quarter or less a piece, most of what I was able to find was Alpha Flight. So a lot of my knowledge of comic books, my base in comic books, legitimately my collection until maybe 4 or 5 years ago was almost entirely Alpha Flight. It is not a team that I'm a super huge fan of, but I've read a lot about them just because that's the comics I could get as a kid from that I got from flea market stuff I was buying. And then I started slowly picking up things like X-Men titles and Spider-Man titles from grocery stores and drugstores when they used to sell comic books. Welcome to the past, kids. So, I do have a background in Alpha Flight. That does not mean it's quite as encyclopedic as some of the other things because I didn't read as hardcore as I did as I do now. So, with that, joining Alpha Flight, the way that all this works. So, as I said earlier, Jean-Paul becomes kind of a pickpocket situation for a little while. He joins a circus, and then his mutant abilities manifest. He realizes that he's faster than other people, so obviously he's like, I'm going to become a pro athlete and be a freaking star at it. So he becomes a skier, a snowboarder type, and he is, as you can see in the picture, he is famous and he draws in all the people. In this, you see him surrounded by ladies. One of the genius things so we talked about him coming out as gay, and that something that's really important to note is you never see him have any sort of romantic relationship, whatever, with a woman. They are simply around him, and he is simply a celebrity that's putting it on. For a while, you don't see him have any kind of romantic things at all. There is a situation where we have a character come in and it is heavily implied that they were previously affiliated, but it's not stated because, this was the 80s and that was witchcraft, right? So, with that, he becomes this, he is a professional athlete, and we have to look at James Hudson for the beginnings of Alpha Flight. And something that's really important to note, the next Frosty features, if it's not the next, no, it's not, it's the one after that, is going to be for Guardian. James Hudson is Guardian, and so some of his origin's gonna have to come out here, which kind of stinks. Ultimately, James Hudson is the beginnings of Alpha Flight. He worked for he worked for a company, and he develops an exoskeleton for terraforming. It's to detect oil, and it kind of becomes this big deal because his boss, whose name was Jerome Jackson, yes, that's correct, Jerome Jackson was like, yo, this thing's pretty tight. I'm gonna sell it to the United States because they're a bunch of warmongers. It is what it is. So he tries to sell the suit, and James finds out, and also another person working on it at the time is Heather McNeil. For those of you that remember the poll where we voted on whether the Alpha Flight team's coming in, there was Vindicator, and Vindicator was Heather Hudson, which is Heather McNeil. So this is James Hudson's future wife. So both of them are like, all right, we resign. And James was like, and as I resign, I'm going to destroy these suits and take the helmet because I made it before we got in and we're going to be fine. And Heather's like, yo, we just screwed over a major corporation. They're probably going to try to get us arrested. Let's contact the government and be like, hey guys, we did this thing. The whole thing was that they're going to track him down for his student loans. It's even real in Canada in the 70s, y'all. Or sorry, this is by now it's the 80s. But so so she calls the government, and the government's like, and the prime minister is like, yo, I like the way you handled this, and I like that suit, man. What can we do? And James is like, yo, you know what's really cool in the United States? They got this thing called the Fantastic Four. They're pretty cool. What if Canada had a superhero team? And the Prime Minister's like, you just keep coming out with these bangers, bro. Let's do this. This is how they talked in the 80s, for those of you who weren't there. So they developed this thing called Department H. Department H is essentially our Avengers division kind of situation. So, and this also created, at first they want to make this team called the Flight. And the Flight is the first iteration of them trying to make, the team. So they're going to call it the Flight. And it's going to be super cool, and James is going to figure this out. So he takes his exoskeleton and he remakes it into his original battle armor kind of thing. His costume is where he got his powers originally. So he is putting this stuff together, and the writers are like, this guy's going to be called the Guardian. And Marvel's like, no, they're not, because Guardians of the Galaxy is going on right now. And you can't do that. So his first name was Weapon Alpha, right? So with this, in this time period is also where the Alpha Flight come across Wolverine, Feral, and it's actually just Heather and James. But they find Wolverine, Feral in the woods, and they kind of, they capture him, not capture him, but they help him, and they get him back to his humanity. He gets the moniker of Weapon X. We don't know this at the time, but it's retconned. And, they are using him in Alpha Flight for a short period of time, and then he heads south to the X-Men, which is a big point of Alpha Flight's origins, because as I said earlier, they are introduced in X-Men 120 and 121. So with that, they start recruiting, and they make branches of teams, right? So they've got Omega Flight, Beta Flight, and Alpha Flight, and that they tier that way, right? Alpha Flight being at the top. So they will pull people throughout the different teams to come into Alpha Flight. This is actually where we get Puck, for those of you in the back. Puck's an interesting character because he's an Alpha Flight, but also he's we see him in Infinity Watch, and that's one of those fuzzy, let me know in the comments. I think they're the same character, but they might not be, but they look kind of similar. I don't know. Anyway, with that, Alpha Flight is being put together. Heather and James scour the nation of Canada to find their Alpha Flight team, and they put together a team of our people. And Heather's really not involved at first. She does eventually take on the Guardian role after James Hudson appears to be dead for a while, and so she comes as Guardian, and then she takes on the name of Vindicator for poll reasons. And we'll talk about it in a second. So ultimately, we start putting together an Alpha Flight team, and the Prime Minister's like, yo, Wolverine's pretty strong, and he's down there making moves with X-Men. What you doing? And James is like, don't worry, I'll go get him. So he's like, I'm gonna go to the U.S. and I'm gonna get me a James Howlett. I'm gonna get me a Logan. And he goes down there, and Logan and the X-Men are like, because James thinks he can take on the X-Men by himself. He is wrong, very wrong, very wrong. And so he licks his wounds, goes back to Canada, and he's like, that really teed me off. So I'm gonna change my name. Since I need to redeem myself, instead of being Weapon Alpha, I am now the Vindicator. So, also, as a reminder, Guardian coming in is also Vindicator. So he's the Vindicator for a while until Guardians of the Galaxy died down, and then he became Guardian, right? So he's the Vindicator. He brings Alpha Flight this time. He's going to come and take over. This version of Alpha Flight, making the team being Aurora, Northstar, Shaman, Snowbird, and himself as the Vindicator, and they run south to take on the X-Men and get absolutely and utterly waylaid, right? Just get absolutely knocked out, and they have to go back and lick their wounds yet again. But so that's a big thing that to keep in mind of as far as comic book history is concerned. This is a pretty good, just kind of big note. X-Men essentially was the strongest selling comic book of all time come the 90s. In the 80s, it was doing fairly well, right? Alpha Flight was something that Marvel wouldn't let go, but it never performed very well. But they based an awful lot of big plot points in Alpha Flight, so they didn't really ever let it go, even though it never was the seller that X-Men was. So Alpha Flight was doomed to lose from the beginning. So that is essentially, as much as that is from the beginnings of Alpha Flight, we have Jean-Paul kind of picked and pulled out of the darkness and brought into Alpha Flight, and that's as much as it kind of goes. Him and his sister don't vibe at first, because it's one of those things where it's like, oh yeah, that's your twin sister, and he's like, no way, I haven't seen that person in a long time. Quite frankly, forgot she existed. And they get together and they do the thing that the Wonder Twins do. They put their hands together, and all of a sudden they can shine bright as a star and blind all these people and run super fast or whatever. And if they're connected in some kind of way, they're much stronger. That's sort of their situation. So next up, we're going to talk about his coming out story, because I find it very interesting, especially in hindsight, and it's a very controversial point. So in looking up Northstar, what you're going to find first is this situation. It's him coming out of the closet. So we see this is North. Also, Northstar's got this thing where his hair's either black or he very much has like this Magneto thing going on where it's like black and white or whatever. Very edgy. And also in this run, he was much like bigger than he is normally. Usually you see him in this kind of slender figure, but in this season he's like this big jacked guy. So in this situation, we've reached the early 90s, and I think it's the early 90s. Anyway, the AIDS epidemic is rampant, right? So this storyline, and this is where it takes a lot of flack, is this storyline heavily revolves around that of the AIDS epidemic. So what's going on here is, after a mission, Northstar hears some crying coming from a trash can, and he finds a baby in there. And finding this baby, he's feeling, obviously, he's like, oh my god, there's a baby in the trash can, what do? I'm gonna take it to a doctor. So he takes it in, and the doctors, of course, are on the team some way or another. He takes it inside, and tests are done on the baby, and it turns out that this baby is positive for AIDS and is likely going to die. So Jean-Paul adopts this baby and calls it Joanne, just to give it the love that it deserves at such a young age. And what ends up happening is we have Major Maple Leaf. So, for my people in the back, Major Maple Leaf is an Alpha Flight character who is essentially the Canadian version of Captain America. He's from World War II. He's sort of out of place, whatever, but for the context of the story, Major Maple Leaf has a son that dies in the 60s, and he dies due to AIDS. And so, with this, the whole team nationally, because not only is Jean-Paul Northstar part of the Alpha Flight, he's also a professional athlete, right? So everybody knows who he is, and him adopting this baby and taking care of this baby becomes national news. It's in all the papers, and Major Maple Leaf gets real freaking bent out of shape by it, and he busts through a wall, and he literally shows up. He's like, I'm gonna kill this baby. And Northstar's like, okay, interesting move. Why? And he's like, hey, my son died of AIDS and no one cared, but this baby gets AIDS and everybody cares. Screw this. I'm gonna kill the baby, right? Obviously the best way to take on the situation, right? So as you can see, this is pretty clunky. The thread line here is pretty clunky. We could use any villain in the world, but we use Major Maple Leaf. They start fighting. It's a big thing. In mid-fight, Major Maple Leaf essentially is like, no one cared about my son. No one cares about any of this stuff. You, Northstar, wouldn't understand any of it. And then all of a sudden, mid-fight, throwing a punch, Northstar's like, I'm gay, right? And this is how the first mainstream superhero came out. Mid-fight, in a fight between two heroes about AIDS, right? So that sort of, at that point, we see a bit of a tide-turning situation, and they fight, but they're also fighting with the words, it's the 90s. I'm going to just stick with it being in the 90s. I can't remember if it's late 80s or into the 90s. But ultimately, there's a whole bunch of talk, and essentially the fight starts to wind down, and they're mad about the same thing, and, you know, just because the injustice was done to his son does not make it okay for the injustice to happen to baby. They wind down, and Northstar's like, the only way we're going to be able to end this is together. And then they hug, and it's wonderful and cute. And then they start to walk back into the building, and as the fight ensued, baby Joanne died. And Northstar and Major Maple Leaf, almost called him Captain Canada, Major Maple Leaf have to kind of work together in a solemn way and kind of try to celebrate the life of this child that was around for a very short period of time. Very kind of clunky story overall, but very impactful on the world of comics, very impactful for the situation, and the follow-up run is just as clunky, if not worse. Like I said, there's a lot of controversy around this and the following storylines about his coming out and kind of the homophobia that kind of the way it is treated, right? So definitely do your own research, read your own things, and make your own assertions. But at the end of the day, this is a milestone that had to be met to get to where we are today in a much more hopefully a much more, at least a little bit more accepting environment. So it's important to think of. If you Google Northstar, that's gonna be one of the main things you point out. So I really wanted to talk about it. So with that, we're gonna move on to power level. Marvel Strike Force doesn't care about power levels, but here on Frosty Features, we do know the way this works. If you are a multiversal threat, you are a threat to not just your reality, but all realities. You can topple the multiverse as we know it. Universal means you can end your reality, perhaps hop on over to another one and end that one. Cosmic means that you are a threat on a planetary scale, taking out things like a planet or something like a small solar system or galaxy. Nuclear means that you have power equivalent to that of a nuclear bomb, leveling things like small cities or even a planetary body with enough time and effort. Super soldier means that your abilities are beyond all of that of human beings, taking out things like brick walls or even city blocks with enough time. City means that you are equivalent to that of a human being trained to the absolute and utter peak ability. This in Marvel is where we find a lot of our ninjas, our secret agents, our mercenaries, etc. And then there's Greg, that dirty Greg. Greg is the undead Asgardian that is spawned by Hela in Marvel Strike Force and left to his own devices. He's not worth a thing, right? So, due to undead Asgardian physiology, and just because I like to make the argument, we're equating Greg to that of a regular human being. So, theoretically, if I'm alone and my car has broken down and I'm pushing my car up, across the thing, struggling because I'm a regular human being, and then all of a sudden I slip and I break the spoiler off, and Greg comes out of the woods and attacks. I, theoretically, as a human being armed with the spoiler of my car, could theoretically take on Greg one by one. Frosty wins. Woo! So Greg is a regular human being. In the case of Northstar, the person, our MSF Speedster for Marvel Strike Force Alpha Flight, where do we find him? Nuclear. He's nuclear. Here's why. His ability to approach speed levels of light and the amount of damage that he can cause around him, also concussive blasts included, he can take out things up to like neighborhoods or something like a small city when he fully lets go. Typically Northstar, very much like our friendly neighborhood Spider-Man, is holding back so that he doesn't damage the things around him. The other types of people that do this are people like Thor or Silver Surfer or Gladiator, who, if using their powers in a confined space, could just absolutely destroy said confined space. right? So a lot of the time when you're a threat to the area around you, you are very high powered. So both, because his sister's not in the game and probably won't be for a very long time, if ever, Northstar and his sister Aurora both easily at the nuclear level, potentially even higher if they can control their powers and if we could see a little bit more of them. But as I've stated before, they're not even a mainstay in Alpha Flight. They're not always there. So it's one of those things where there is a lot about them, but it really is still kind of in development. So that is what that is. And in the according to Scopely, I kind of already pointed out some of the things that were wrong with this. He discovers his mutant abilities before he is a skier, so that's actually why he gets into pro sports. So that's not even correct. They don't even bring up his light manipulating powers, which they're not going to be in the game. And that is also one of the byproducts, one of the main reasons why he is who he is. So that's not brought up in there either. So at the end of the day, they got it twisted, right? They got the things they got correct. It looks like they were kind of reading the same story, but they wrote it all. They kind of just did it however they did it, right? So not quite there. But that is Frosty Features Northstar. I hope that you all have y'all had a good time. Please let me know in the comments your favorite Northstar moments, or if I got anything wrong. I love to hear it. Please be sure to like, share, and subscribe here on YouTube. It doesn't cost you anything but a couple of clicks. As a reminder, I stream weekly on Sundays, 8 a.m. Central Standard Time at the link above, where we do Frosty Features Live. I hope that you all have a fantastic day and a fantastic week. And most importantly, all, stay cool.